She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence she brought into the room was louder than any plea, more devastating than any scream. The silence tore through the obsidian lounge like a blade through shadow. While the reference child's voice cracked with terror, Delisha Williams brought a quiet so raw it could shatter bone. Her white lace dress hung in tatters, stained with grease and a desperation that needed no translation. The beads woven into her braids clicked frantically as she stumbled forward, the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone mute. Her small hands reached for the one man in the room who hadn't moved, the one man who looked like he'd forgotten how to feel anything at all. The music died. Amber liquid froze in crystal glasses midair. Every killer in a tailored suit held their breath because the girl hadn't just interrupted a multimillion-dollar deal. She had breached a fortress. And the man she'd chosen to alert wasn't just dangerous. He was Jang Dong-jin, the slicked-back shadow of Seoul's underworld, a ghost in a black suit who lived behind a wall of calculated ice. The bold geometric tattoos along his neck and chest seemed to tighten as she gripped his arm, her small fingers digging into ink and muscle like he was the only solid thing left in a drowning world. Dong-jin looked at where her trembling finger pointed, out toward the neon veins of the city where a brilliant mother was being erased, and his face showed a shock that didn't just break the rules. It shattered them so completely that those who witnessed it would spend their lives trying to forget the moment the Ice King finally thawed. The silence in the armored SUV was different from the silence in the obsidian lounge. In the lounge, it had been a weapon, a way for Jang Dong-jin to exert power without breathing a word. Here, trapped in the leather-scented confines of the speeding vehicle, the silence was heavy, vibrating with the frantic clicking of Delisha's beads as she trembled. Dong-jin sat perfectly still, his black suit jacket draped over the girl's small shoulders to hide the white lace dress that had been ruined by grease and terror. His own blood felt like it was turning to slush, a familiar numbness trying to reclaim him. But every time his eyes caught the bold geometric tattoos on his neck in the reflection of the glass, he felt the coil of the dragon tightening. He didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the neon veins of Seoul screaming past the window. He looked only at Delisha. She wasn't crying anymore. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point in the air that only she could see. She began to move her hands. It wasn't the fluid, practiced grace of traditional sign language. It was something sharper, more rhythmic, a series of precise gestures that traced invisible lines in the air between them. Dong-jin leaned forward, his mouth slightly open, a flicker of concern breaking through his marble statue mask. He realized she wasn't just gesturing for help. She was drawing. Her small index finger sliced through the air, marking a sharp left, then a long, straight line, followed by 3 rapid taps against the back of the passenger seat. "She's not just pointing," Dong-jin murmured, his voice a low rasp that made his driver's eyes dart to the rearview mirror in surprise. "She's giving us the route." He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a tablet, opening a blank digital notepad. He handed the stylus to Delisha. Her hand was shaking so violently the pen nearly clattered to the floor, but as soon as the tip touched the screen, a transformation occurred. The fear didn't vanish, but it was pushed back by a terrifying, focused intelligence. With the precision of a seasoned architect, the 7-year-old began to sketch. She didn't draw a house or a stick figure of her mother. She drew a grid. She drew the structural weak points of an industrial complex, marking guard rotations with small, rhythmic dots and entry points with jagged X's. It was a map of a fortress, etched into the mind of a child who had been trained to survive a world that wanted to swallow her whole. Dong-jin watched the lines form, a cold chill slithering down his spine. He recognized the tactical genius behind the layout, the way the exits were positioned to catch attackers in a crossfire, the way the ventilation shafts were marked as the only safe passage for someone small enough to move through the dark. This was the work of Deanna Williams. She hadn't just left her daughter a message. She had left her a blueprint for a war. "Mama said," Delisha signaled, her fingers moving in a frantic blurred shorthand that Dong-jin found himself deciphering through pure instinct. "If the shadows come, I am the key. I have to find the dragon and show him the way in." The mention of his own Underworld moniker from the hands of a child who couldn't hear the whispers of the streets hit Dong-jin like a physical blow. He looked at the map, At the warehouse district by the river she was sketching with such agonizing detail, and then back at the girl. She was the legacy of a woman who had known exactly what kind of monsters were coming for her and had gambled everything on the hope that one monster might still have a heartbeat. Incheon District, Dongjin said, his voice hardening into the steel of a commander. He didn't need to check the coordinates. The map in the girl's mind was clearer than any GPS. He tapped his comms unit, his eyes never leaving the digital grid that promised either a rescue or a slaughter. Hyun-soo, change of plans, he commanded, referencing his only trusted associate. We aren't going to the safe house. We're going to the industrial graveyard at Pier 7. And tell the team to bring the heavy kits. We aren't just retrieving a witness anymore. We're breaking into a tomb. Delisha looked up at him as the car swerved into a sharp turn, her dark eyes searching his face for a promise. For 5 years, Dongjin had been a ghost who offered nothing but silence and shadows. But as he looked at the intricate, desperate map she had carried in her head through the vents and the darkness, he felt the ice around his heart crack wide open. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering for a second before settling gently on her head, careful not to snag the white flower clip. It was the first time he had touched anyone with kindness since he had held his sister's hand as she bled out in the rain. I see it, Delisha, he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear the words. I see the way. Your mother is still fighting. Now it's my turn. Outside, the Han River loomed, a black ribbon cutting through the fog, leading them toward a graveyard of rusted metal where a brilliant woman was running out of time. Inside the car, the silence was no longer a weapon of the Mafia. It was a pact between a man who had lost everything and a girl who refused to let her world go dark. The rhythmic hum of the SUV's engine shifted into a low, predatory purr as they pulled into the shadows of a secure underground garage. The neon fever of Seoul was left behind, replaced by the sterile, flickering fluorescence of a safe house that smelled of concrete and cold ozone. Dongjin didn't wake the girl. He lifted Delisha with a lightness that seemed impossible for a man of his build, his tattooed arms cradling her like she was made of fine porcelain. She didn't stir. The exhaustion of terror had finally claimed her, her head lolling against his shoulder, the white flower clip in her hair snagged slightly against the rough wool of his suit. Inside the safe house, he laid her on a leather sofa, draped his jacket over her once more, and stood back. He watched the steady, shallow rise and fall of her chest, the only peaceful thing in a world currently sharpening its blades. You're looking at her the way you used to look at the garden, a voice rasped from the shadows. Hyun-soo stepped into the light, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars earned in Dongjin's service. He held 2 glasses of amber liquid, offering one to his boss. Dongjin didn't take it. He didn't take his eyes off the girl. She's deaf, Hyun-soo, Dongjin said, his voice so thin it barely carried across the room. She sees the world in shapes and silence. She drew a tactical map of a level 5 security facility on a tablet with a shaking hand. Her mother. She didn't just raise a daughter. She raised a soldier. Hyun-soo leaned against a concrete pillar, eyeing the girl. She's a liability, Jean. The board is already screaming. They saw you stop the meeting. They saw the Ice King melt for a kid in a lace dress. If we go to Pier 7, it's not just a rescue. It's a declaration of war against our own interests. Dongjin finally turned. The geometric tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim light, their sharp angles echoing the hardness in his jaw. You think this is about the business? You think I'm doing this for a logistics contract? He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the black sprawl of the city, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. He reached up, his fingers tracing the scar that began just below his ear and disappeared into his collar, a mark hidden beneath the ink. 15 years ago, Dongjin began, the words coming out like stones being ground together. Before the suits, before the shadow title. There was Hannah. Hyun-soo went still. Hannah was a name never spoken, a ghost that haunted the foundation of their empire. She was 10. She wanted to be a dancer, Dongjin whispered. She couldn't hear the music either, Hyun-soo. She used to put her bare feet on the floorboards just to feel the vibrations of the radio. She'd dance to the heartbeat of the house. He closed his eyes, and for a second, the cold Mafia Boss vanished. In his place stood a boy who had failed. When the rival clans came for my father, they didn't go for his throat. They went for his heart. They took Hannah to a warehouse not unlike the one Delisha drew. I was there. I was smart. I was tactical. I waited for the right moment. I waited for the backup that never came. I chose the rules over the blood. He turned back to the room, his eyes burning with a sudden, violent light. By the time I broke those doors down, the music had stopped. The vibrations were gone. I held her in the rain, and the only thing I could hear was the silence. That's when the ice set in. I told myself that if I never felt anything again, I'd never have to hear that silence again. He looked back at Delisha. One of her braids had come loose, the beads resting against the leather. But then this girl walks into my club. She doesn't say a word, and yet she's screaming. She's pointing at the same shadows that took Hannah. And for the first time in 5 years, the ice isn't just cracking, it's shattering. Hyun-soo looked at the glass in his hand, then at the girl. He saw the way Dong-jin's hand was trembling. The man who could headshot a target from 50 yards without blinking was shaking because of a child's lace dress. If we do this, Hyun-soo said quietly, there's no going back. The council will see this as a weakness. They'll come for you next. Dong-jin walked over to the sofa and knelt beside the sleeping girl. He carefully tucked the stray braid back, his fingers lingering near the flower clip. He looked like a man who had finally found a reason to breathe after being underwater for a decade. Let them come, Dong-jin said, his voice regaining the lethal razor-edged clarity that had made him a legend. They think emotion is a crack in the armor. They don't realize it's the fuel. I spent my life building a fortress of ice to stay safe from the ghost of my sister. But Delisha didn't ask for a ghost. She asked for a dragon. He stood up, the black suit jacket clicking into place as he straightened his shoulders. The concern was still there, buried deep in his eyes, but it was now wrapped in a terrifying resolve. Gear up, Hyun-soo. We're going to Pier 7. And if anyone stands between that girl and her mother, I'll show them exactly what happens when a ghost decides to come back to life. As they walked toward the door, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic clicking of Delisha's beads as she turned in her sleep, dreaming of a map that led to a home she wasn't sure still existed. Behind her, the shadow of Seoul moved into the dark, no longer a king of ice, but a man on fire. The fog at Pier 7 didn't just roll in. It crawled, a thick, gray shroud that smelled of salt, rusted iron, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Jang Dong-jin stood at the edge of the concrete pier, his black suit blending into the darkness, the gold chain around his neck catching the rhythmic flash of a distant lighthouse. Behind him, the industrial graveyard was a labyrinth of stacked shipping containers, red, blue, and rusted orange, creating a canyon of steel that swallowed the sound of his men's footsteps. Delisha's map was a masterpiece of survival. As Dong-jin looked at the layout of the primary warehouse, he saw exactly what the child had sketched: the blind spots in the security cameras and the specific shipping crates positioned to provide cover. He moved with a predatory grace, his hand resting on the grip of the suppressed firearm at his hip. Beside him, Hyun-soo moved like a shadow, but it was his second-in-command Min-ho, who led the point. The girl's map says the mother is in the sub-level of Section B, Min-ho whispered, his breath hitching slightly in the cold air. If we hit them from the north, we can pin them against the water. Dong-jin paused. Something in the air tasted wrong. It wasn't just the fog. It was the way the cranes above them seemed to lean in, like silent witnesses to a trap. He looked at Min-ho, a man he had pulled from the gutters of Busan 10 years ago, a man who knew the story of Hannah. Min-ho was looking at his watch, his thumb rubbing the casing with a nervous, repetitive motion. The north entrance is a bottleneck, Min-ho, Dong-jin said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. We'd be exposed for 50 yards of open concrete. Why would we go north? The cameras are looped there, boss, Minho replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. It's the only way to get the drop on them. Dongjin looked back at the digital tablet where Delicia's drawing remained. The girl hadn't marked the north entrance as a way in. She had marked it with 3 rapid taps, the same rhythmic signal she used for danger. He realized then that the map wasn't just a guide to the building. It was a guide to the betrayal Deanna Williams had likely seen coming. Before he could speak, the silence of the docks was shattered. But it wasn't a gunshot. It was the blinding flare of floodlights erupting from the tops of the containers. Ambush! Hyun-soo roared, diving behind a stack of industrial pallets. The darkness vanished, replaced by a searing white glare that turned the fog into a wall of milk. From the elevated catwalks of the warehouse, a rival syndicate's enforcers opened fire. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy-caliber rounds chewed into the concrete, sending sparks and stone chips flying like shrapnel. Dongjin didn't panic. He moved. He grabbed Minho by the collar, dragging him behind the heavy steel door of a container just as a volley of lead shredded the space where they had been standing. How did they know the timing, Minho? Dongjin hissed, his eyes wide and burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. The geometric tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his racing heart. They must have had scouts. Minho yelled over the roar of the gunfire, his face pale, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the freezing wind. Boss, we have to retreat to the north. Dongjin watched a red laser dot dance across Minho's chest. It stayed there, steady and calm. The shooters weren't aiming at Minho. They were waiting for him to move. They were waiting for him to lead the Ice King into the crossfire. The realization hit Dongjin with the force of a physical blow. The mole wasn't a low-level soldier or a disgruntled dealer. It was the man he had trusted to guard his back. You told them, Dongjin whispered, the sound cutting through the chaos of the gunfight. You told them I was coming for the girl's mother. You told them the Ice King had a crack in his heart. Minho's eyes shifted, the mask of loyalty finally slipping to reveal a hungry, desperate ambition. You're weak, Jean. You stopped a multimillion-dollar deal for a deaf brat who can't even scream. The council doesn't want a father. They want a leader. Jiha offered me the seat you're too soft to hold anymore. Minho reached for his weapon, but Dongjin was faster. In one fluid motion, the Mafia Boss pinned Minho against the steel wall, his forearm crushing the man's throat. I'm not soft, Minho, Dongjin growled, his face inches from the traitors. I'm just finally awake. A grenade thudded onto the concrete nearby. Dongjin kicked it into the water just as it detonated, a geyser of Black River water and fire erupting into the air. In the confusion of the blast, Dongjin saw the rival gang's leader, Jiha, standing on the warehouse balcony, laughing as his men closed the circle. Hyun-soo. Flash and clear. Dongjin commanded. Hyun-soo tossed 2 magnesium flares into the center of the pier. The world turned into a silent, white void. Under the cover of the brilliance, Dongjin didn't retreat north. He followed the map in his head, the one Delicia had drawn. He vaulted over a low concrete barrier and slid into a service trench that led toward the southern vents. He left Minho cowering in the shadows, knowing the rival gang would have no use for a traitor who failed to deliver his prize. As Dongjin crawled through the dark, cramped space of the trench, the smell of grease and old blood filled his lungs. He wasn't thinking about the council or the millions he was losing. He was thinking about a white lace dress and the way a child's silent pointing had saved his life twice in one night. The first clash was over, but the war had just begun. The shadow of Seoul was no longer just fighting for a territory. He was fighting for the woman who had trained her daughter to be his compass. He emerged from the trench inside the warehouse's lower level, the cold ice of his old life completely gone, replaced by a fire that would burn Pier 7 to the ground. He checked his magazine, the silence of the sub-level ringing in his ears. Somewhere above him, Deanna Williams was waiting. And he was the only monster left who could bring her home. The air in the sub-level of Section B was thick with the smell of stagnant seawater and the dry metallic tang of an overworked ventilation system. Deanna Williams sat zip-tied to a rusted metal chair, the shadow of a massive gantry crane looming over her like a guillotine. Despite the bruise blooming across her cheekbone and the cold sweat dampening her brow, her eyes remained sharp, the eyes of a woman who calculated variables for a living. Across from her, Jiha paced the concrete floor, his silhouette jagged against the flickering worklights. He was a man who understood violence but lacked the patience for precision. Beside him stood a laptop, its screen glowing with the frantic red icons of a locked shipping manifest. "The override, Deanna," Jiha growled, stopping just inches from her. He leaned in, the smell of cheap cigarettes and desperation clinging to him. "My buyers are waiting at the terminal. If that cargo doesn't move in 10 minutes, you become as disposable as the crates upstairs." Deanna didn't flinch. She leaned her head back, her breathing rhythmic, a technique she had practiced during long nights of data stress testing. She wasn't just a researcher, she was a master of systems, and right now, the system was the only thing keeping her alive. "You're using a legacy AES-256 encryption shell with a rotating salt," she said, her voice steady despite the dryness of her throat. "If you try to brute force the gateway again, the system will trigger a dead man's switch. It won't just lock the manifest, it will wipe the local server and alert every port authority from here to Singapore." Jiha's hand twitched toward the pistol at his waist. "Then give me the codes." "I can't give you what doesn't exist yet," she countered, her mind racing through the logic gates of the shipping terminal software. "The codes are generated based on a real-time weight check of the cranes. If I don't manually calibrate the load-bearing sensors from this terminal, the gate won't open." "You want the cargo? You have to let me into the kernel." She was lying. The system was complex, but not that complex. She was building a digital labyrinth, one logic brick at a time, to buy the minutes she prayed Delisha was using to find safety. Every second she spent explaining cascading login failures and logistics bottlenecks was a second closer to a rescue she had to believe was coming. Jiha gestured to one of his tech enforcers, a sweating man in a headset who looked increasingly out of his depth. "Is she telling the truth?" The man hesitated, glancing at the wall of scrolling green text on his monitor. "The protocols are unusual, sir. It's an American-coded logistics suite. If she's right about the weight sensors, we could trigger a terminal-wide lockdown." Deanna watched the flicker of doubt in Jiha's eyes. She knew his type. He feared what he couldn't control with a blade or a bullet. She leaned forward as much as the zip ties would allow, her voice dropping into a tone of professional authority. "Look at the screen, Jiha. See that Sector 7 alert? That's not a malfunction. That's the system waiting for a manual handshake. I can bypass it, but it takes time. Precision. If you want those millions, you need to step back and let me work the sequence." She was stalling, using her knowledge of the shipping codes like a shield. She had built these systems to be impenetrable to outsiders, and now she was weaponizing her own creation against her captors. As the tech enforcer began to type under her direction, Deanna deliberately fed him a series of redundant commands, loops that would keep the processor humming without ever actually opening the gates. In the back of her mind, she counted the heartbeats. She thought of Delisha's white lace dress and the beads in her hair. She thought of the way she had whispered to her daughter to find the man with the dragon, a gamble born of a decade of studying the power players of Seoul. She knew Jang Dongjin's history. She knew about the girl he had lost and the ice he had grown to protect himself. She was betting her life that the Ice King still had a crack in his armor. 5 minutes, Jiha hissed, checking his watch. "If that red light doesn't turn green, I'm sending Min Ho to find your daughter. I'm sure she has a much simpler way of making you talk." The mention of her child sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline through Deanna's veins, but she didn't let it reach her face. She forced her fingers to stay steady as she dictated another string of useless code. "For minutes," she replied, her eyes fixed on the screen. "But if you interrupt the sequence now, we lose everything." Suddenly, a dull thud echoed from the floor above, a vibration that traveled through the concrete and into the soles of her feet. It wasn't the sound of cargo shifting. It was the sound of a breach. Deanna's heart leaped. She saw the confusion on Jiha's face, the way he turned toward the heavy steel doors of the sublevel. She turned back to the screen, her fingers moving with a new, frantic purpose. She wasn't stalling anymore. She began to actually tap into the warehouse's internal security feed, bypassing the enforcer's clumsy blocks. A grainy black and white image flickered to life in a hidden window. Through the smoke and the strobe light flashes of gunfire in the main bay, she saw him. A man in a black suit, moving with a terrifying liquid precision, a dragon coiling around his neck like a promise of vengeance. The Ice King had arrived. And as Diana locked eyes with the camera, she didn't see a monster. She saw her daughter's compass. "The sequence is complete," she whispered, but she wasn't talking to Jiha. She slammed her bound hands onto the entered key, not to open the shipping gates, but to kill the lights in the entire sector, plunging the room into a darkness that only a predator could navigate. The darkness that swallowed the warehouse was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that smelled of old oil and iron. For any other man, it would have been a tomb, but for Jang Dongjin, the blackness was an old friend, the same silence he had lived in for 5 years. He moved through the sublevel with a ghostly fluidity, his black suit blending into the shadows until only the faint rhythmic shimmer of his gold chain betrayed his presence. He wasn't alone. In his left hand, he gripped his mobile device, the screen dimmed to a sliver of light. On the other end of a secure video feed, Delisha sat in the safe house under Hyun-Soo's watchful eye. She couldn't hear the gunfire echoing in the rafters above, and she couldn't hear the heavy breathing of the men hunting her mother, but she was watching the same blueprints he had memorized. "Show me, Delisha," Dongjin whispered into the void, knowing she was watching his silhouette. On the screen, the girl's small hand appeared. She didn't sign, she pointed. Her finger moved with a sharp, percussive urgency, tracing a path through the obstacles Dongjin couldn't see. He followed her direction with blind faith, stepping over a tripwire hidden in the dark and sliding behind a massive steel pillar just as a flashlight beam swept the corridor. The light belonged to one of Jiha's enforcers, a man whose shadow stretched like a distorted giant against the rusted walls. Dongjin didn't wait for the light to find him. He became the shadow. He moved within the fraction of a second when the guard turned his head, his hand reaching out to catch the man's throat before he could draw a breath to scream. The struggle was short, a muffled scuffle, the creak of leather, and then silence once more. Dongjin checked the feed again. Delisha was pointing toward a heavy reinforced door at the end of the hall, but her expression had changed. Her eyes were wide, and she was tapping her chest rapidly, the signal for a heartbeat, for something alive and dangerous. "A trap," Dongjin breathed. He reached the door but didn't push it open. Instead, he pulled a small fiber-optic camera from his pocket and slid it under the gap. The view on his screen shifted to the room beyond. Jiha's men were positioned behind crates, their weapons trained on the entrance. They weren't looking for a girl anymore. They were waiting for the dragon. In the center of the room, Diana was visible, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of a terminal, her hands moving with a frantic rhythm that mirrored her daughter's. Dongjin saw the way the room was rigged. It wasn't just men with guns. The floor was crisscrossed with pressure sensors that would trigger a series of overhead industrial magnets, turning the room into a crushing cage of falling metal. It was a kill box designed for someone with his exact tactical profile. He looked back at Delisha on the screen. She was pointing not at the door, but upward, toward the ceiling's ventilation shafts. She began to mimic a crawling motion, her small face set in a grimace of concentration. She was showing him the ghost path, the route she had used to escape the same facility. "I see you, little one," Dongjin murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time in years. He scaled the side of a rusted freight elevator, his fingers digging into the cold metal as he hoisted himself into the narrow, lightless vents. The space was cramped, smelling of dust and dried blood, but as he crawled, he felt a strange sense of clarity. Every time he hesitated, he looked at the screen, and there was Delisha, her silent pointing acting as a lighthouse in the dark. He was moving through the very veins of the building, the same path the girl in the white lace dress had taken to save her mother. He could feel the vibrations of the facility, the hum of the servers, the distant shouting of Jiha's frustrated men, the heavy thrum of the river outside. It was the same way his sister Hannah used to feel the music through the floorboards. He reached a grate directly above the terminal where Diana sat. Below him, Jiha was screaming, his patience finally snapping. The lights, damn it. Get the backup generators online or I'll kill her now. Dongjin saw Diana's eyes dart toward the ceiling. She couldn't see him through the grate, but she sensed the shift in the air. She began to type even faster, creating a diversion of scrolling error messages on the screen to draw the guard's attention away from the shadows above. On his phone, Delisha made one final sign. She clenched her fist and then opened it, mimicking an explosion. Dongjin didn't hesitate. He kicked the grate open, the heavy iron falling like a stone. He didn't drop down with a shout. He fell like a predator, silent and lethal. Before the guards could even turn their flashlights toward the ceiling, Dongjin was among them, a whirlwind of black silk and gold chains. The smoke from a nearby fire suppression canister began to hiss, filling the room with a thick, white haze. In the chaos of the shadows and the smoke, Dongjin reached Diana's side. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, the same grounding touch he had given her daughter in the car. Diana looked up, her eyes meeting his through the shifting fog. She saw the dragon on his neck, and for the first time since her abduction, the calculated mask of the researcher broke into a look of pure, raw relief. She found you, Diana whispered, her voice cracking. She did more than find me, Dongjin replied, his gaze shifting toward the door where the rest of Jiha's men were beginning to swarm. She led me. He drew his second blade, the steel catching the dying light of the terminal. The trap had been sprung, but the hunters were now the ones trapped in the dark with a man who had finally found his heart. The warehouse had become a slaughterhouse of shadows, but as Jang Dongjin traded shots with the encroaching enforcers, he realized the tide was shifting. Beside him, Diana Williams was no longer a captive. She was a conductor. She had scrambled over the terminal's console, her fingers moving across the haptic interface with a fluidity that defied the remaining numbness in her bound wrists. She wasn't just bypassing firewalls, she was accessing the facility's primary automated infrastructure, a sprawling network of overhead gantry cranes, conveyor belts, and massive hydraulic sorting arms that spanned the entire length of the warehouse. The sensor array is live. Diana shouted over the thunderous cracks of gunfire. I have the crane control, but I need you to lead them into the center aisle. If you keep them pinned behind the support pillars, I can't get a clear line of sight. Dongjin didn't hesitate. He surged forward, his black suit a blur of lethal motion. He fired 2 controlled bursts into the ceiling lights, plunging the main floor into a disorienting, strobing half-light. Follow me, he commanded, though the order was intended more for the chaos than for any specific soldier. The rival gang, blinded and pushed by the ferocity of his assault, instinctively retreated toward the center of the warehouse, the kill zone Diana had identified. From her terminal, Diana's eyes flashed with a cold, analytical brilliance. She saw the rival syndicate's men clustering near the heart of the sorting floor. She slammed her hand onto the manual override. Above them, the heavy gantry crane, a behemoth of steel and cable, screeched into motion. It didn't move with the steady pace of logistics. It moved with the violent, jarring speed of an executioner. Now, Dongjin, she screamed. Dongjin ducked behind a stack of steel pallets just as the massive magnetic clamp descended from the ceiling. The crane swung like a pendulum, a 5-ton slab of magnetized steel sweeping through the center of the aisle. The heavy armor and weapons of Jiha's men were useless. The magnet ripped their rifles from their hands, dragging the men themselves off their feet and slamming them into the heavy-duty shipping containers. It was a symphony of industrial violence. The clash of steel on steel, the shouts of confusion, and the relentless, mechanical precision of the cranes under Diana's command. Dongjin emerged from his cover, his movements sharp and efficient. While Diana controlled the vertical space, he owned the ground. He neutralized the remaining stragglers with clinical accuracy, his gold chain glinting in the dying sparks of the electrical short circuits. He moved toward Jiha, who was desperately trying to navigate the swinging, magnetized nightmare of the gantry system. "You thought you were playing a game of logistics," Dongjin said, his voice cold and steady as he leveled his weapon at the rival leader. "You didn't realize that in this facility, the infrastructure itself has a master." Jiha snarled, reaching for a secondary detonator in his vest, but Diana saw it on the security feed. She triggered the nearest conveyor belt, which roared to life with a sudden violent torque, pushing a crate of heavy machinery components into Jiha's legs. He went down, his weapon skittering across the polished concrete. Dongjin was there in a heartbeat, his boot pinning Jiha to the floor. The warehouse was still, save for the rhythmic humming of the automated systems and the groan of the metal strained by the magnetic clamp. Diana stood from the console, her zip ties hanging loose, her face smeared with soot but her expression one of utter, calculated triumph. She walked toward the center of the warehouse, her movements poised. She didn't look like a victim anymore, she looked like an architect of her own rescue. She looked at Dongjin, who stood amidst the debris of a broken syndicate, the dragon tattoo on his neck stark against his sweat-dampened shirt. For a moment, the violence fell away, and they were just two people who had spent their lives dealing with the weight of things. One with ice, the other with logic. "The harbor security is locked down," Diana said, her voice steady. "The system is fully compliant. We own this sector now." Dongjin lowered his weapon, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ebb. He looked at the woman who had turned a tomb into a weapon, and then at the girl's map still glowing on his device. They had survived the ambush, they had reclaimed the facility, but as he glanced at his comms unit, he saw a message from Hyun-soo. "The safe house has been compromised. They took her." The victory in the warehouse was absolute, but the war was far from over. The Ice King's gaze shifted to the distant, fog-choked pier. The dragon was ready to finish what the Phoenix had started. The warehouse did not simply catch fire, it inhaled the oxygen and exhaled a roar of orange defiance. Diana's final command to the terminal had done more than kill the lights. She had overloaded the sub-level capacitors, turning the facility's power grid into a countdown. The air grew thick and heavy, shimmering with a heat that made the shadows dance like frantic ghosts. "We have to move. Now," Dongjin shouted, his voice cutting through the mechanical groans of the dying building. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed Diana's hand, his leather-gloved fingers locking around her wrist with a strength that was firm but grounded. Behind them, a series of muffled thuds echoed from the sublevel, the sound of transformers surrendering to the surge. A tongue of blue flame licked out from a ventilation duct, quickly followed by a plume of acrid black smoke. They sprinted toward the southern exit, the ghost path Delisha had mapped. The gantry cranes Diana had weaponized now hung limp and lifeless, their steel skeletons silhouetted against the encroaching fire. As they reached the shipping bay, the first major explosion rocked the foundation. The concrete beneath their feet shuddered, and a row of glass windows shattered outward, showering the pier in a rain of crystal diamonds. They burst through the heavy steel doors just as a fireball blossomed in the center of the warehouse, venting through the roof in a pillar of light that turned the fog-choked night into noon. The force of the blast threw them forward, tumbling them across the wet, salt-slicked concrete of the pier. Dongjin was on his feet in a second, shielding Diana's body with his own as debris, bits of charred manifest and melted plastic, fell around them like black snow. The warehouse was now a skeletal furnace, the roar of the flames drowned out only by the distant wailing sirens of the harbor police. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They sat in the shadow of a rusted shipping container, the heat from the burning building at their backs and the freezing spray of the Han River in their faces. The silence that followed the explosion was ringing and hollow. Diana leaned her head against the corrugated steel, her chest heaving, her fingers trembling as she wiped a streak of soot from her forehead. She looked at Dongjin. The Ice King was gone. His black suit was torn, his slicked back hair was disheveled, and the gold chain around his neck was Duluth with ash. But it was his eyes that held her. The shock and concern she had seen in the lounge had evolved into something more profound. "You're bleeding," she whispered, pointing to a jagged red line along his jaw where a glass shard had grazed him. Dongjin touched the wound, then looked at his blood-stained fingers as if they belonged to a stranger. He didn't feel the pain. He only felt the terrifying, electric hum of being alive. "It's nothing," he said, his voice a low rasp. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, but the image of Delisha was still there, frozen in the last frame of their video call. "She saved us, Deanna. She didn't just find me. She navigated this entire graveyard for me." Deanna took the phone, her thumb tracing the image of her daughter's face. A single tear tracked through the soot on her cheek, carving a path of clean skin. "She's the strongest person I know. I spent my whole life trying to build systems to protect her, but she was the one who broke the fortress down." Dongjin watched her, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire behind them. For 5 years, he had been a man of stone, believing that to care was to create a crack for the world to exploit. But looking at Deanna, seeing the fierce, unyielding intelligence that had turned a warehouse into a weapon, he realized that connection wasn't a crack. It was the foundation. He reached out, hesitating for a heartbeat before placing his hand over hers on the cracked screen. The geometric tattoos on his neck were stark in the orange light, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "I lost my sister because I waited for the rules to save her," Dongjin said, the confession falling from his lips like a heavy weight. "I told myself I'd never let that silence happen again. When Delisha walked into my club, she broke 5 years of quiet. I'm not letting it go back to the way it was." Deanna looked up, meeting his gaze. In the reflection of his eyes, she saw the burning bridge behind them, the old lives they were leaving in the ashes. "They won't stop, Dongjin. Minho, the council. They'll see this as a betrayal." "Let them," Dongjin replied, his grip on her hand tightening. "They're fighting for a crown. I'm fighting for a family. They have no idea how much more dangerous that makes me." A soft beep echoed from the phone. A new message from Hyun-soo illuminated the screen, but before Dongjin could read the grim update about the safe house, a moment of pure, silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer the Mafia Boss and the researcher. They were the dragon and the phoenix, forged in the same fire, looking toward a horizon that was no longer empty. The bridge was gone. The only way was forward, into the dark, together. The digital screen in Dongjin's hand didn't just display a message. It screamed of a failure that turned his blood back into ice. "Safe house breached. Delisha is gone. Minho has her." The fire from the warehouse threw jagged, dancing shadows across Deanna's face as she read the words over his shoulder. The air between them, once thick with the heat of the explosion and the warmth of their shared resolve, suddenly turned arctic. Deanna's hands, which had just been dancing across a terminal to crush an empire, now curled into white-knuckled fists. The phoenix wasn't just grieving, she was weaponizing her rage. "Minho," Dongjin hissed, the name tasting like poison. He didn't waste time on curses or oaths. He turned toward the harbor road, his eyes locking onto a dark sedan idling near the warehouse perimeter, the vehicle Hyun-soo had left as a contingency. "He's heading for the water," Deanna said, her voice eerily calm, the analytical coldness of a tactician masking the terrified mother beneath. "He knows the warehouse was a dead end. If he has Delisha, he's going to the private docks on the North Quay. He's looking for leverage to bargain with Jiha's remnants or the council." Dongjin didn't answer. He vaulted into the driver's seat of the sedan, the engine roaring to life with a mechanical snarl that mirrored his own. Deanna was in the passenger seat before the door had even latched, her eyes already scanning the navigation system. The drive to the pier was a blur of neon streaks and rain-slicked asphalt. Dongjin drove with a terrifying, absolute focus, threading the car through the narrow, crowded arteries of the industrial district. He ignored the sirens, ignored the red lights, and ignored the cautious whispers of his internal survival instinct. Every mile that brought him closer to the North Quay felt like a lifetime of penance for the 5 years he had spent as a ghost. "He's cut the tracking signal," Deanna noted, her fingers flying over her own device as she tried to ping the small, hidden sensor she had stitched into the lining of Delisha's white lace dress. "He's using an EMP jammer." He knows how I think. Then stop thinking like a researcher and start thinking like a predator, Dongjin replied, slamming the car into a sharp drifting turn that left a scar of burnt rubber on the concrete. Where would you go if you were him? If you knew I was coming? Diana went silent. Her jaw tightened, and she stared into the dark expanse of the harbor. He wouldn't go to the public piers. He'd go to the decommissioned freighter, the Sea Ghost. It's grounded in the shallows past Pier 9. It's the only place he can hide a boat without being spotted by harbor security. The silhouette of the Sea Ghost emerged from the fog like a leviathan's tombstone. It was a massive, rusted hulk, canted at an awkward angle against the mud of the shallows. On the deck, a single, flickering light revealed the dark shape of a vehicle parked near the gangplank. Dongjin killed the headlights 200 yards out. He coasted into the shadows of a stack of rusted shipping containers and killed the engine. The silence that filled the car was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Stay here, Dongjin commanded, his hand reaching for the blade at his hip. No, Diana said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She reached into the glove box and pulled out the backup sidearm she had snatched from the warehouse floor. She's my daughter, Dongjin. You aren't going in there alone. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same fire that had burned in his own heart the night he vowed to change. He nodded, once. A silent pact formed in the darkness. They moved toward the freighter not like men, but like ghosts reclaimed from the grave. The pier was deserted, save for the rhythmic slap of the black water against the rotted pilings. As they crept closer, Dongjin saw him, Min-ho, standing at the base of the gangplank, a cigarette dangling from his lips. And there, held loosely by her arm, was Delisha. The girl looked small, her white lace dress a ghost of purity against the grime of the ship. She wasn't fighting, she was too smart for that, but her eyes were searching the dark, scanning the shadows with a desperation that shattered Dongjin's composure. Min-ho was laughing, his voice echoing over the water. Come out, dragon. Let's see if the rumors are true. Let's see if you'll trade your life for a girl who can't even hear your final words. Dongjin felt the dragon on his neck coil, the ink itching against his skin. He stepped out from behind a container, his hands raised, his face a mask of iron. Let her go, Min-ho, Dongjin said, his voice carrying over the waves like a death knell. You've already lost the council. You've already lost the warehouse. Do you really want to lose your soul for a bargain that's already expired? Min-ho's grip on Delisha tightened, his gun pressing into her side. I'm not trading, Jean. I'm finishing it. The final betrayal had reached its breaking point. The pier was a tinderbox, and the spark was about to ignite. Dongjin took a single deliberate step forward, the shadow of the Sea Ghost swallowing him whole. The air on the deck of the Sea Ghost felt like a physical weight, cold and saturated with the smell of wet rot and impending finality. Min-ho's hand was a vice around Delisha's arm, his gun barrel pressed cruelly against the delicate skin of her ribs. He was laughing, a jagged hollow sound that barely pierced the roar of the Han River churning against the rusted hull. He was backing toward the edge of the freighter, eyes wild with the frantic terminal energy of a man who knew he had already lost the game. One step, Jean. Min-ho roared, his knuckles white against the steel of his pistol. One more step and the girl joins the ghosts of the harbor. Let's see how much that dragon heart bleeds when you have to explain to her mother why she's sinking to the bottom of the river. Dongjin stood frozen. He wasn't thinking about the council. He wasn't thinking about the millions in offshore accounts that had once defined his reality. He wasn't even thinking about the reputation that had kept him as the Ice King for half a decade. Every ounce of his focus was on Delisha's eyes. She wasn't looking at the gun. She wasn't looking at the man holding her captive. She was looking past him, at the shadow behind the shipping crate where Diana had silently circled around. The girl's eyes moved once, a subtle flicker to the left. A signal. A map. You're right, Min-ho, Dongjin said, his voice dropping into the smooth, hypnotic calm that had made him the most feared negotiator in the underground. He kept his hands open, palms upward, a picture of surrender. You've lost everything. The warehouse is ash. Jiha is being hunted by his own men. You're holding a child, but you don't even have the power to feed her. Shut up. Minho screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. I'm not a king anymore, Dongjin continued, his voice dropping another octave, drawing Minho's attention forward, pinning him in place with the sheer gravity of his presence. I'm just a man who realized that the ice was never a shield. It was a prison. You want the crown? Take it. It's heavy, it's cold, and it's buried under 5 years of regret. But she isn't part of the bargain. In that split second of distraction, the world seemed to slow to a crawl. Diana burst from the shadows of a container, her movements blurred with the precision of a predator. She didn't lunge for Minho, she lunged for the girl. Minho swung his weapon, a feral snarl escaping his throat, but Dongjin was already moving. He didn't fire a shot. He closed the distance with a speed that defied the laws of momentum, his body a blur of black silk. He collided with Minho just as the traitor pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, shattering a rusted porthole, and then they were both hitting the deck, a tangle of limbs and desperate primal fury. The struggle was brief and brutal. Dongjin didn't fight like a criminal. He fought like a man protecting his own blood. He caught Minho's wrist, twisted until the bone groaned, and slammed the man's head into the iron deck with a finality that silenced the night. Minho slumped, his eyes rolling back, his ambition finally extinguished against the cold, unyielding rust of the ship. Dongjin rose, chest heaving, his face splattered with the grit of the pier. He turned just in time to see Diana pull Delisha into a crushing embrace, burying her face in the girl's braids. Delisha was trembling, the beads in her hair clicking softly against Diana's shoulder, her small hands clutching the back of her mother's jacket as if she were anchoring herself to the world. Diana looked up at Dongjin, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Dongjin looked down at the gun Minho had dropped, then back at the woman and the girl who had changed everything. He stepped away from the fallen traitor, away from the freighter, away from the dark life he had constructed to keep his heart from breaking. He had spent 5 years being the crown of Seoul, a silent ruler of shadows, but in the silence of the pier, he realized he had never felt more alive than he did in that moment, standing in the rain with the only people who had ever truly seen him. It's over, he said, his voice soft, purged of the ice. He didn't need the crown. He didn't need the club or the name. As he walked toward them, he wasn't the Ice King of the Underworld anymore. He was simply a man coming home. The dragon on his neck seemed to soften in the moonlight, a silent promise that the ghost had finally laid his burden down. The pier was quiet, and for the first time in 15 years, Dongjin didn't fear the silence. He welcomed it. The neon lights of Seoul were distant now, reduced to a flickering, harmless pulse against the horizon as the storm over the harbor finally broke. Inside the quiet, minimalist apartment that Diana had reclaimed as a sanctuary, the air was no longer heavy with the smell of ozone and gunpowder. It was scented with something faint, the lingering smell of rain on pavement and the steady, grounding presence of a life finally beginning again. Delisha sat on the rug by the window, her back turned to the room, her small hands moving with an intense, rhythmic focus. She was playing with leather scraps and silver charms, the clicking of her beads a soft, percussive counterpoint to the rain tapping against the glass. Jang Dongjin stood in the doorway, his charcoal suit jacket draped over the back of a chair. He wore a simple black shirt, the geometric tattoos on his neck and chest no longer hidden by high collars or hidden agendas. He watched her for a long time, the man who had once been a ghost now learning how to occupy space in a home. She's been working on those for hours, Diana said softly from the kitchen, her voice light and devoid of the tactical edge she had carried in the warehouse. She walked over, leaning against the doorframe, a cup of tea in her hand. She doesn't know how to explain what she's feeling in words, so she builds it. Dongjin nodded, his expression softening. He crossed the room and sat on the floor near Delisha. She didn't look up, but she shifted to make room for him, her movements intuitive. As he sat, she held up 2 small, braided leather bracelets, one intricately woven with silver dragon charms and the other with delicate, embossed phoenixes. She held them out to him, her eyes searching his face with a silent, profound clarity. Dongjin took them, the leather still warm from her small hands. He felt a lump form in his throat, a sensation that would have terrified him only months ago. He realized then that he didn't need to speak to be understood. The silence between them wasn't the cold, empty vacuum of his past. It was a bridge. It was the language of people who had been through the fire and chosen, collectively, to walk out the other side. For us, he whispered. Delisha nodded, her smile small but radiant. She reached out and took the dragon bracelet, gently fastening it around his wrist. Her fingers brushed against the dragon tattoo on his forearm, and for the first time, he didn't feel the phantom weight of his sister's death. He felt the reality of the girl in front of him. He took the second bracelet, the phoenix, and leaned toward Diana. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, he saw the mirror of his own transformation. He fastened the phoenix around her wrist, his touch lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She says we needed something to remind us that we're a team, Diana translated, though she hadn't needed to watch Delisha's hands to understand the meaning. She says we saved each other. Dongjin looked at his wrist, the silver charm catching the dim light. The Ice King had built a fortress to avoid the pain of loss, only to find that the only way to truly survive was to let the world in. He looked at Diana, who had used her intellect to survive a hell of his own making, and at Delisha, who had led him through the dark with nothing but a pointing finger and a brave heart. He reached out, pulling them both into a circle, a family forged in the wreckage of a life he had once been all too eager to abandon. He realized he had finally found his voice, not through words or threats, but through the courage to be vulnerable. He wasn't the shadow of Seoul anymore. He was the man who had stopped the music so he could finally hear the heartbeat of the people he loved. As the rain slowed to a drizzle outside, Dongjin rested his forehead against Diana's, the silver dragon and phoenix charms clinking softly against each other. The silence of the apartment was full, rich with the promise of tomorrow. The weight of the past finally settled into the bedrock of memory. He had come looking for redemption, but in the end, he had found something far more dangerous and far more beautiful, a reason to stay. The dragon and the phoenix were home.